Welcome back to the narrated PowerPoint for Chapter 12. Let's dive in. So this is Part 2. Part 1 was pretty long, right? But this is Part 2. Here we go. So we talked about the trait approach, and we talked about the behavior approach. Well, starting in the 1960s, researchers decided they thought there was a little bit more to this whole leadership thing than just who people were in terms of their characteristics or traits. And what they did in terms of their behaviors, they reasoned that there seemed to be more to the whole leadership puzzle. In other words, there was more involved in trying to decide what made someone an effective leader versus a not so effective leader, or a leader versus a follower. I'm going to be talking about 3 different contingency approaches to leadership. First, the situational leadership approach, then the path-goal theory of leadership, and finally, the Vroom and Yetton leadership decisions approach. What all 3 of these have in common is that when we say contingency, what we mean to say is that whether someone is an effective leader or not depends on, that's the key phrase, depends on some factors. They could have to do with the followers, they could have to do with the situation. But basically, there are factors other than who the leader is or what the leader does that determines whether the person is effective or not in their leadership role, and even again, whether they're a leader versus a follower. So the question is, what are those factors and how do they work? So we'll start by talking about the situational leadership approach. This was developed by 2 researchers whose last names are Blanchard and Hersey. And what they decided was that whether a leader was effective or not had to do with whether they used the right style of leadership as a function of an employee's readiness or a follower's readiness. And they came up with 4 different styles that a person might use. So here we have this beautiful table, and what it should say underneath me is match style to follower readiness level up at the top. So on the bottom, in the bottom row there, you see the 4 different leader styles: directing, coaching, supporting, and delegating. Let me briefly describe each. Directing behavior is just like task-oriented behavior, where what a leader does is tell the followers or the employees what to do, how to do it, when to do it, with whom to do it. So it's all about the task. Do this, do that, etc. Coaching is when a leader identifies specific things that a follower is doing and gives that person specific guidance focused on that particular follower's abilities, skills, etc., just like whatever an athletic coach does. Supporting behavior is essentially the same as relations-oriented behavior. So telling people that we're in their corner, showing them respect, demonstrating consideration for them, that's what supporting behavior is. And then finally, delegating behavior is basically turning things over to the followers, to the employees, and letting them go ahead and figure things out themselves because they can. When is it appropriate to use each of these 4? Well, according to the model put together by Blanchard and Hersey, it's most appropriate to use directing behavior when followers' competence is low, so they don't really know what to do, but their commitment is high, so they want to do a good job. Perfect example, you've got an employee who's brand new, who doesn't really have much of a background in what you're going to be asking them to do, but they really want to do a good job. They're highly committed to doing a good job. They just don't know stuff yet. Well, under those circumstances, it makes sense to just tell the person, well, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to do it. This is when you need to do it, and so on. Moving over a little bit, the person who, once again, a follower who doesn't know how to do what needs to be done for whatever reason, their competence is low, But in this case, maybe their commitment is also low. They've taken a job where it's not really what they want. Well, here, really specific coaching is going to be appropriate. So it's not just sort of a generic, here's what everyone who comes in new needs to know, but rather in your particular case, you're not all that knowledgeable and you don't seem very energized, very jazzed up about what is needed. Here's something specific that you might do. When a follower's competence is moderate to high, so it's decent perhaps, and their commitment is maybe all over the place, well, in this case, Blanchard and Hersey recommend supporting behavior. Again, show people that you're in their corner. Again, they pretty much know what they're doing, but they just might not be all that enthusiastic about the job. Well, here we want to show them, hey, I'm here for you. I care about you. And the final category, over all the way to the right, when the follower is very competent, so they know what they're doing. Maybe they've been in the organization for a long time and they're highly committed. Well, at that point, the leader can basically turn things over to that follower because, well, they know what they're doing. They don't need a boss to tell them what to do. They don't even need a boss to tell them they're great. They kind of got that. They basically need the boss to get out of the way. And that's what delegating is. It's getting out of people's way. The second situational theory is path goal theory. And this theory basically says that employees will be motivated. They will be motivated. They will do what they need to do if they are confident that the rewards they will receive are valuable to them, their high performance will be rewarded, and finally, their effort will lead to high performance. Now, I'm going to talk more about what you're seeing on this slide when I talk in Chapter 5 about something called expectancy theory of motivation. But for now, all I want you to think about with respect to this slide is that essentially followers or employees will be motivated when their leaders have made sure that the rewards for behaving a certain way actually matter to the employees, when the leaders have made sure that when employees do a great job, that they actually get those rewards, and that finally, the leader makes sure that the followers, the employees, can in fact exert the effort needed to achieve the degree of performance being expected. This theory has 4 leadership styles, 2 of which will look really familiar to you. The first one, directive, again, telling people what to do. This aligns with task-oriented. The second one, supportive. Again, this aligns with relations-oriented, basically helping people know that they're doing a great job, respecting them, showing them consideration, and so on. The third is participative. This is a little bit like delegating, but here what we're doing, you're the boss, you're the leader, you've got a bunch of followers, a bunch of employees, and what you do is you involve them in deciding what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. You involve them in choosing their tasks. You solicit their input before you, the boss, make decisions. Maybe you even let them go ahead and make decisions. Finally, achievement-oriented is when you, the boss, the leader, set really high, challenging goals. Okay? So those are the 4 styles. Let's see how this works. So each of these styles has situations where those styles are going to work. In other words, what I mean by that is if a leader displays that particular style, that leader will be perceived as effective if the stuff that's listed over under situation, if that stuff is in place. So for example, directive leadership works great when employees have high role ambiguity, when they're not really sure about the role that they're playing. So it's ambiguous, there's uncertainty. The directive style, again, where the leader is telling people what to do, also works great when employees have low abilities. It could be, again, because they're new to a job, so they want someone to tell them what to do. Directive will also work well when employees have an external locus of control. Remember what that is? It means they don't see things as being in their control. They don't believe that they can themselves decide what to do. They look to someone outside of them to basically tell them what to do. What you see listed under situation, these are the contingency variables. So the employee has high role ambiguity. That's a contingency variable that is going to affect whether a leader's chosen style will work. If the leader chooses to be directive, it'll work, holding everything else constant. The phrase we use for that in Latin is ceteris paribus, again, which means holding everything else constant. So when does a supportive style work? When is that good? When will that be effective? Well, it will be effective when what the employees are doing, maybe it's boring, it's repetitive. I mean, it's easy to do. You don't need instruction as the employee. You just need someone to be nice to you. And that's what being supportive is, essentially. It's being nice to people. So I've got a boring and repetitive job. I want a boss who's nice to me. Or I have a job that's highly stressful. I need a boss who gets that, who understands that my job is super stressful. I need a boss who's supportive. Participative works best when you've got employees who have high abilities. Maybe they've been there a long time. Maybe they're highly credentialed, right? They know what they're doing, basically. Well, then they want to be involved in deciding what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. They don't need somebody to tell them what to do, nor do they need somebody giving them high fives, telling them they're great, right? They've got the knowledge, skills, and abilities. When the decision that needs to be made is relevant to the employees, they care about the decision and what happens as a result, it's a really good idea to involve them in that decision making, to be participative. And also, when employees have a high internal locus of control, remember what that is. Here we're talking about people who believe that they exert control over what happens to them, that what happens to them is a function of their decisions. Well, with folks like that, they definitely want a participative leader, someone who gives them a chance to go ahead and make decisions, to weigh in on the things that matter to them. Finally, achievement-oriented leadership can work great when you have people, again, who maybe have high abilities, okay, so they're good at what they do. Well, you can go ahead and set high goals for them. And when they have what's called high achievement motivation. I'll talk about this more in Chapter 5. People who have this internal drive to achieve at a very high level, well, they want a boss who's going to believe in setting really challenging goals for them. They dig that. That's going to get them moving. The final contingency approach that I'm going to talk about is Vroom's decision tree approach. Here we have some choices. Sometimes we have time-driven decisions. Those need to be made on a timely basis. Sometimes bosses are having to make decisions that are more developmentally oriented, where we maybe want to think about how we're going to make decisions based upon our belief that our employees, our subordinates, our followers need to improve or develop their decision-making skills. So we've got a couple of different things that we're thinking about. The styles that we might use as a leader, as a manager, to make decisions, there are three. The first is autocratic, auto, self. Auto means the manager or the leader makes the decision. The second is consultative. Here, the manager or the leader consults with employees or followers, maybe one-on-one, that's individually, or pull them all together in a room, but ultimately the manager decides. So the manager or the leader consults with, solicits ideas from, but then the manager decides. And then the final option is delegating or facilitating, where the team decides. So the manager, the leader just gives the whole thing over to the team. Y'all decide. The person might delegate, that's what I just described, where they just turn the whole thing over to the team, or they might facilitate a conversation where they lead the meeting, but it's still the team that decides, not the manager. So the question is, when should a manager do which one of these? When should a manager just make decisions autocratically? when should a manager consult, and when should a manager delegate. So under what conditions or what contingency factors should a manager or leader consider when trying to decide how to make a given decision? Well, here are some. Not all, but here are some things, some factors. One would be decision significance. If the decision to be made is very important, the manager really only has two options. They don't have the three. They don't have three options. They've only got two options. They have to choose between autocratic, in other words, they just make the decision themselves, or consultative, where they solicit input from their followers, but they, the leader, still makes the decision. With really important decisions, ultimately, the buck has to stop with the leader, with the manager. Again, that person can just decide themselves, or they could consult with their employees, their followers, but ultimately they need to make the call. Importance of commitment. Here I'm talking about commitment on the part of the followers. If it's really important that the followers get on board, again, the manager has two options really, and one of them is not autocratic. If you need your followers to commit to something, if they're failing to commit means you won't be a success, ergo you really need their commitment, the two options you have are you can consult with them, so you solicit their input, hear their ideas, and then decide, or you delegate to them. You can't be autocratic. When you've got the expertise as the leader, once again, you really only have two choices. You either make the decision by yourself autocratically, or you could solicit input from your followers on some aspect of the decision that needs to be made. And again, ultimately, you decide. You've got the greater expertise. You're certainly not going to turn the decision over to your team. You're the one who knows best. It makes no sense to turn the decision completely over to them. But what about a situation where the group has the expertise, where they're the ones who know best? What should you do then? Well, again, you really only have two options, and one of them is not autocratic. It makes no sense for you to make the decision yourself, none at all. Rather, it makes the most sense for you to either consult with them, these experts, right, your followers, and make the call, or you turn it over to them. Let them go ahead and make the call. Now, what might help you to decide in a case like this, whether to do it yourself in terms of consulting with them and then deciding, or turning it over to them? Well, how important is the decision? If it's not that big of a deal, maybe you just hand it off to them. If it is a big deal and they've got the expertise, well, then probably consulting makes the most sense, where you hear their input, but ultimately you make the call. Again, notice these situational factors influence, they affect what is going to lead to the leader being effective. If they decide, in some cases, to make the decision themselves, to do so autocratically, when in fact the situation called for them to consult or delegate, they're not going to be very effective. The bottom line, when we talk about these contingency approaches, is that whether leaders are effective is not simply a matter of their traits or behaviors. It's not that simple. It's not. Also important are the followers, for example, follower readiness, and the situation. How much time do we have? How important is the decision or the behavior? It's all of those things together that determine whether a leader is effective. Not simply the traits that that leader has or how that leader behaves. There's more in play. And that brings us to the end of this second part for Chapter 12. Get ready for the third and final installment. Thanks for listening.